Well, hello, lovely listeners, and welcome to episode 165 of the Assist with Impact podcast. I have a very special treat for you. Episode 165 and 166 are actually a little matched pair. Let me tell you a little bit about why that is. So my guest today on today's podcast, episode 165, is Dr. Peter Fuda, who does not want to be called Dr. Peter Fuda, just prefers to be called Peter. So throughout this episode, you will hear me refer to him as Peter. Let me tell you a bit about Peter Fuda. Peter Fuda, for 2 decades, has been what he describes as a Sherpa to leaders, teams and organisations across the globe as a consultant, coach, author, researcher, speaker, and, as you can hear with the title doctor, a professor of management. Peter and his team at the Alignment Partnership, or what you'll hear us refer to in the podcast as TAP for shorthand, have created dozens of cases of business transformation and thousands of individual cases of leadership transformation around the world. Clients include MasterCard, Kraft, Microsoft, Dow Jones & Co., Philips, Bayer, Mars, Luxottica, Foxtel, Macquarie Group, MSD, Westpac, LensCrafters, Telstra, Suncorp, Rabobank, Scentre Group and the Wall Street Journal, amongst many others. In an environment where 70% of all change efforts fail, TAP has a better than 90% success rate. Peter has coached more than 250 CEOs to measurably increase their leadership effectiveness and performance. Andy Penn, the former CEO of Telstra, and for those of you not in Australia, Telstra is Australia's leading pre-eminent telecommunications company, has said of Peter, "If I can only spend an hour with one person, I choose to spend it with Peter." Peter is the first Australian published on transformation in the Harvard Business Review. He is the executive producer of the documentary film Beyond the Superhero, licensed to Qantas. He is the author of the international best-selling book Leadership Transformed: How Ordinary Managers Become Extraordinary Leaders, and he has taught his original content in the MBA program at Macquarie Business School, one of Australia's leading business schools, for several years. Peter has completed countless speaking engagements to hundreds of thousands of people on 4 continents and is a regular commentator across print, TV and radio media. He is a partner to the Wall Street Journal, regularly speaking at their events around the world, including the World Economic Forum in Davos, the CEO Council and Tech Live forums. Most recently, Peter has been driven by a mission to democratize leadership via an innovative digital product. It's called Enixa, and you will hear more about it in our podcast interview. Peter holds a doctorate in business administration, a master's degree in commerce, and a Bachelor of Arts with first-class honours. I'm going to be honest with you. I am a huge fangirl of Peter's, having first come across his work when I was an EA. I will also say that as a proud Aussie, it brings me enormous pleasure to be bringing Peter to you, my lovely listeners, who are spread around the globe. and who more than likely are unfamiliar with his work. It is so wonderful for me to be able to share such a brilliant and innovative leadership expert like Peter with you. As you know, I am a strong believer that as an assistant, you have the ability to lead from where you are. And you don't need to be a leader of people, to be a people manager, to be leaders, and to demonstrate self-leadership. In this wide-ranging discussion, you'll hear Peter's take on this and how leadership, in his view, is not a position. You'll also hear him discuss what it means to have influence and how it's a factor of two vital ingredients. Peter also shares his observations of the value assistants can bring to their leader. And I asked him that question specifically because as somebody that spends so much time in C-suite offices, he's seeing assistants in action all the time, and he's seeing linchpin assistants in action, and I wanted to know what he sees that differentiates them. But what was really interesting and so wonderful was that given that question, he chose to sing the praises of his own former EA and now operations manager, Jessica Davies. And spoiler alert, that's why this is a matched pair of episodes, because in my next episode, 166, I interviewed Jess about her role with TAP, with the alignment partnership, working alongside Peter and the other people that she works with at the alignment partnership, and her role, how she has navigated her role and grown into her role as operations manager, and how she's showing up as a linchpin assistant. So you can consider this episode with Peter and this next episode, episode 166 with Jess, as a pigeon pair. It is so exciting for me, and it will be the first of many of these types of paired episodes that I plan to do in 2023 to bring you insights from leaders and their linchpin assistants. Please be sure to check out the show notes, the description for this episode and for the episode with Jess, for the links to the app Enixa that we discuss in this episode. You will want to run, not walk, to sign up for your free 30-day trial. And you will want to tell your leader about it, because it is nothing short of an extraordinary self-directed leadership development platform. And you know that I am all about self-directed learning, and this platform, Enixa, is such a wonderful addition to your toolkit. So with no further ado, on with the episode. Welcome to Peter Fuda. Hello, I'm Liz Van Vliet, and welcome to the Assist with Impact podcast. Join me as I explore the competencies and capabilities that allow you to assist with impact. I'll be sharing practical tips, strategies, and insights that will help you move beyond what I call the order taker zone and be that little hinge that can swing big doors. If you're ready to be more proactive and have more impact in your role, then this is the place for you. Let's get started with the episode. Well, hello and welcome, Peter Fuda, to the Assist with Impact podcast. It is so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
It is, and I'm going to have shared with the audience there. They will already have heard me tell them what an absolute thought leader you are, and how delighted I am to bring to my audience, who are assistants and admin professionals all around the world, an Australian thought leader. Means so much to me to be able to share your voice around the world. So let's get started with the first question that I always ask my guests, and that is to give me, just describe for me your experience climbing what I describe as the career spider frame. And listeners to the podcast, they all know that that is the way that I choose to describe, rather than talk about our career ladder as a very linear journey. My experience, and so many other people's experience, is that the next move is not always the right move, and that our careers will take various courses. We might go diagonally, we might go laterally, we might go backwards, we may hopefully go forwards as well. And that wherever you are on that career spider frame, it's the opportunity to take in that view. But I'd love it if you could share for the listeners, because I will already have shared with them your bio, but I would love it if you could share with them some insights from your own experience on that career spider frame.
Happy to, Liz, and it's lovely to be with you. So I think my career would resemble much more a spider web or a spider frame than a ladder. Might be good evidence for your theory there. So actually, I got my education on how the world works in Paddy's markets, where my parents used to have market stalls on the weekend, and I was in there from a very young age, 12 or 13 years old, 14 years old, learning how to sell and deal with customers and all of that. And I remember by the time I was 15, I had my own market stalls, and I took great pride when someone would say, "Oh, when would your parent come back so we can negotiate with them?" I'd say, "No, these are my stalls, you negotiate with me." So I learned a great deal. I probably learned more in Paddy's markets than I did through 3 degrees, honestly. Then I worked in Rebel Sports when that started opening, one after the other. I knew the family that started that whole thing. And so 14, 15, 16 years old, every school holidays, we were a working family. We didn't really go on holidays and do stuff like that. I started working in there and would often be, managing the stores over Christmas periods as a very young person, 16, 17 years old, opening them up one after the other, which was very cool. Then when I hit uni, I started working in one of Sydney's biggest nightclubs. Firstly, out of a love for music. A little known fact, I had a budding career as DJ with, soul and funk music, and I have a deep love of hip hop and rap music, which most people wouldn't put with me. And then that turned into being a promoter in the club and eventually being the manager of the club while I did my first degree, undergrad. So,
and are we going to give the name of that club?
Yeah, it was Kinsella's, the big club in Taylor Square.
Oh wow! Okay,
yeah.
Fascinating.
So actually, truth be told, I started working in there before I was legally allowed to be in there. I think I was 17, but I was in there for many years, and it was very good to me, especially on the kind of more entrepreneurial, promotional side of things. And then at about 23, I was doing very well. Was earning money to buy my first property and to travel and all that stuff. At about 24 years old, I decided I should get a real job, quote unquote. And I read this application in the paper that said, one of Australia's oldest companies is looking for entrepreneurial young people. It was a financial services company, didn't say which one, from different industries to kind of transform the culture. So they were recruiting 50 people from all different walks of life, young people, to come into the bank. And it turns out it was Westpac. So I went to the first interview. They didn't tell me the bank. I apparently did well in the interview. And at the end, they said, "Oh, you're definitely what they're looking for. It's Westpac." And I said, "Oh, you've made a huge mistake. I don't know anything about banking or financial services." "No, you're exactly what they're looking for." So I ended up in what they called the fast track manager program at 25 years old, which was actually, I was at Westpac for 5 years, is where I got my corporate education. And it was actually the only job I applied for, actually ever, but the only job I applied for at Westpac, though I had 5 jobs in 5 years. So I was in the fast track program. I decided it wasn't really for me a few months in. The guy who was running the program, who became a dear friend of mine, said, look, you paid up for 6 months. Why don't we put you in marketing? You seem to have a flair for that. So I went to marketing. I did a good job there. And then someone said, you could be over here helping us with on the sales front, moved me over there. Then they said, actually, you could be great on the change management. And they basically just kept creating roles for me based on the contribution that I was making. And at 28 years old, I ended up basically as the head of change management, working with very senior executives, trying to get 30,000 people aligned to the strategy of the organization. And that's where I started dealing with a lot of big consulting firms, where I learned a lot of the disciplines that I apply today. And at 29, 30 years old, I thought, you know what? I think I could do this. And I stepped out and started what became my management consulting company, which is now 22 years ago.
That is absolutely fascinating. Now, an insight that I'd love you to share for the listeners is, because I've just done an episode where I was talking to someone about being visible, being, amplifying your accomplishments. And I'm curious to know for you, in terms of the fact that you've said that you only ever applied for the role, and then after that, the roles were offered to you. You were moved into these new positions. So what's your perspective there? Was it the fact that you were doing a great job and were seen to be doing a great job, or did you do things to make yourself visible in terms of the fact that you were doing a great job?
That's a great question, Liz. I don't think at the time I had a particular sense that I needed to, because I didn't think I knew what I was really doing. I was just focused on growing and contributing. Right? And these are my words in retrospect, which, when we talk about it a bit later, for me are the most fundamental tenets of leadership: growing and contributing. And my sense is that because the world is pretty mediocre, if you grow and contribute, if you grow yourself personally, if you grow your impact, if you contribute, for example, for me, I would always focus on exceeding the expectations of my boss and making him or her look fantastic. And then, what I didn't realize at the time, but I certainly realized by the time I left, and I've leveraged it very well in building my consulting practice, is what somebody says at the moment they are asked about you is the difference between your career going in one direction or another. It's the difference between getting a new client or not. So when somebody says, tell me about Peter Fuda, or tell me about TAP, my management consulting company, or Enixa, my digital product, they're asking that person whom they respect to give them a shortcut. Is this something I should be interested in or concerned with? And if that person in that moment says, actually, Peter contributes superbly, he's a team player, he's focused on making an impact, he's done nothing but grow and contribute, that moment is worth an exponential amount of impact. And so I've always been very aware of that, and we can talk about maybe how that's shown up later in life. The other thing I'll say, which will be important for your audience, one of the reasons I said yes, Liz, to this audience is because of how important I believe the EA audience is in a healthy, functioning organisation, and also in terms of the people that I serve. We actually, in our practice, because the CEO is the client, ultimately, we build very deep relationships with the EA, starting with the CEO's EA. And I'll tell you that at Westpac, at 28 years old, so my boss worked for the CEO, that I could get meetings in the diaries of the executive team better than most of the executives could get in their fellow executives' diaries because of my relationships with the EAs. So I very quickly figured out, A, I liked them, and B, I figured out their importance. And because of the quality of relationships, they would give me time in their executives' diary that they weren't giving the other executives, which is ridiculous in retrospect.
That's fascinating. Well, you've opened the door for my next question, which was that in your, extensive exposure to the offices of CEOs, Australia and internationally, you have had that opportunity to, see that office of the CEO and of other executives at the C-suite level through that lens as an external stakeholder. So I'm fascinated, and I think it would be great for the listeners to hear any particular examples that come to mind where you have witnessed an assistant or a team of supporting a CEO where they have been doing what I describe as leading from where they are. And when I use that phrase, I'm talking about, my listeners know that is one of the power skills that I promote and help empower them to develop. And it's all about this idea of not relying on de facto positional authority. It's building the situational authority that you have. So I'd love it if you could share any memories or examples you have of seeing that in action.
Yeah, sure. And just before we go there, though, a couple of principles. So we obviously are very aligned, Liz, and I already know that, around what leadership really is. Most people falsely believe leadership is a position. Leadership is not a position. First and foremost, it's a mindset. Anyone can lead from anywhere at any time in any context, including every one of your listeners. Once it's a mindset, then it can become a tool set and a skill set. But first and foremost, leadership is a mindset. We all know people in positions of authority who do not lead, and we know people who have no authority at all, who lead every day. Some of the greatest leaders in history that we look up to, the Gandhis, the Mother Teresas, the Rosa Parks, none of those three, for example, ever had a formal position of authority in their whole life. And Rosa Parks was a seamstress and a secretary in Montgomery, Alabama, who refused to give up her seat. And that action sparked the bus boycott. And most historians, one of my first degree was in history, most sensible historians say that is what ignited the civil rights movement. Right? So seamstress and a secretary showed everybody what leadership looked like. So we're very aligned on that point as a start point. It's definitely a mindset, not a position. If I was to think about, I've seen lots of great examples, but I actually have one very close to home in my own EA, Jess, who joined me a couple of years ago. And so Jess now is operations manager across all of my different enterprises. I have multiple companies and offerings and so on. And Jess basically is the interface. She's the interface between me and everybody else. And the reason why and doing a magnificent job. And so practically at this moment, when I have never had more important things to do, 12 grand finals a week, basically, I've never had more time, more capacity, and more thinking space. And she's the reason why. Right? So she's like a 10x multiplier. And the first principle I would talk about for your audience is, do they think of themselves primarily as an enabler or a controller? So the very best EAs that I've experienced, so this is your world, but from an external point of view, see themselves as an enabler of their client, their boss, not a controller. Not a blocker and a tackler. Of course, you need to do some of that, but the best EAs in my experience are enablers. They're force multipliers.
Yeah.
So if I was to kind of build on, what's made Jess so impactful in my life, which has allowed me to amplify my contribution to the world in all sorts of different ways, is her attitude and her energy match mine. So she's, passion is one of the values that we have across all my different enterprises and companies. Of course, I care deeply about everyone in our team and if they're having a hard day or whatever. But when the lift doors open, each of us don't decide whether we want to be passionate today. It's a minimum standard, a minimum expectation. And so Jess has that every day, number one. Number two, she focuses on contribution over credit. So she's not constantly seeking to be perceived as doing a great job. She's focused on her contribution, and the outcomes become self-evident. The third thing that we have done together really well is to quantify the areas where she can learn and grow and take more stuff from me. My philosophy of leadership is, if somebody else can be doing what I'm doing, they should be doing it, because then that frees me up to do more stuff. And so, for example, I'll give you, we have our biggest client of my digital product, my digital company. This is a very important client. They have 5,000 licenses. All of that came through me for a long time. Jess now is the operations manager. We had a big relaunch of Enixa, the app, which I know we'll talk about later. I did a kickoff thing to 300 people. Then there was a follow-up session the following day with 100 internal change agents. Not only didn't I go to that, but the person who led that was Jess. So she stood up in front of 100 very senior people, someone who was an EA 2 years ago, and guided them through in both thought and practice leadership. Here's how they could really make the best of Enixa. Here are the principles that it was founded on. This is their role as executives and change agents, and had a magnificent impact, at least as good as what I would have had, right? So in 2 years, never having ever stood in front of 5 people to explain anything, to being in front of one of Australia's biggest companies, 100 senior executives, leading them through a session. And the way we did that was effectively breaking down her journey from, assisting me to becoming an expert herself, to then developing the confidence and the competency to stand in front of people over time, and progressively moving through all of those stages with no fear and no ego until she was ready to stand in front of that stage and actually deeply confident to do it, and did a magnificent job. So she'd be a real living, breathing example. It's not theoretical for me at all.
So I hope you will be okay when I invite Jess to be a guest on the podcast.
You should absolutely do that. And part of me thought, I'm not sure why you got me here. You probably should have her.
Well, no, I am absolutely. I think it would be a great match set of episodes. And in the future, it is my vision to have executives and their EAs as a joint interview. I just haven't got there yet, but thank you for that. That's wonderful to hear that Jess is making such a valuable contribution. And it ties into, again, something that I train EAs in, which is that idea of the doing, is the idea of being able to do the doing, connecting the outputs to the outcomes and the impacts is a really important part of being able to raise their gaze and think more strategically in terms of that contribution that they're making. And again, as you said, it's not about seeking validation or seeking affirmation or seeking praise. Well, all of those things are important things that they can do for themselves. And of course, I encourage executives to recognise the contribution, but making those connections is the first step to affirming your value as an assistant. So thank you for illustrating that with Jess.
My pleasure, Liz. In fact, maybe let me just build on a little bit more. Maybe it's a little bit deep, but all humans have needs. We have a need for connection with others. We have a need to feel important and significant. We also have a need to grow and contribute. And my experience is when we focus on needs like getting the approval of others, being liked by others, feeling like we are significant to others, we actually trap ourselves in a very different scenario. We become needy, we become less service-oriented, our contribution diminishes, and eventually, it just becomes tiresome. It's not contributing. So for me, in my world, I think of myself as in service, not subservience, in service of my clients. And then, of course, Jess is in service of me. Mm-hmm. And then someone else is in service. And so if we're all in service of the people that we ultimately serve, and we do that supremely well, the paradox is that we get much greater rewards and recognition as a consequence. But the only time I ever really sought rewards and recognition, I didn't really get them. Whereas now I end up in an argument with clients, where they're going, that was amazing. I'm like, no, you were amazing. No, Peter, you were amazing. So it becomes, they will have an argument with me about how significant my contribution is, where I'll be having an argument with them about, no, actually, they make my life a pleasure, and isn't it wonderful? That's a very different energy to me trying to manipulate you into giving me some kind of praise,
so I can feel good about myself.
That's wonderful.
Two very different things.
Yeah, really, that's wonderful. That's really, I think that's really deeply helpful for the assistants that listen to my podcast. Thank you, Peter.
Pleasure.
We've talked a little bit about the idea of leading from where you are. So now if we talk about leader effectiveness, I'm all about encouraging assistants who, focus on all of the things that we've talked about and that we're aligned on. But the idea of leader effectiveness and the tendency that some leaders and, many leaders have in getting immersed in busy work. And one of the challenges that I put to assistants is to build their power skills, their ability to influence without authority, to be able to manage up and to be able to manage their manager, in order to be able to mirror back to them or hold a mirror up to them, to be able to communicate to their leader that they are getting too caught up in the busy work. So I would love it if you could share just any ideas that you might have. And I already, this sort of like what do we call it in Parliament, a Dorothy Dixer, because obviously I'm a member of, I've been on Enixa, the platform, that your digital platform. So I've got some questions that I've already shared in some of my training that I've gotten from you. But if you could share with the listeners the language that you might recommend that would be helpful to help the EA convey to their leader that their goal, that their, as in the assistant's goal, is to help optimize that leader's time and energy.
So, Liz, there's quite a lot in that. There's a lot of different ways we could go, because part of it is we can talk about practically and tactically, how do you help a leader focus on the things that matter? But I think the first part of your question is really about having the influence to be able to do that. So let's just start with a premise, and you're already there, which has influence and authority are two very different things. If you think about it, every single person I work with and have ever worked with has a much bigger job than me, right? Effectively, I run a couple of small businesses, really, truthfully. And the people I'm working with and serving, some of them run corporations that are $40, $50 billion, enterprises. So every single one of them has a bigger job than me, and yet my livelihood depends on them taking my advice, okay? So obviously I've learned a thing or two about influence. The first thing I would say is, if you accept that influence has nothing to do with your position, that really your influence is a function of two things. Ultimately, it's a function of your currency and your courage. There are tactics and you need some competency down the road, but the start point is currency and courage. So before anybody goes off trying to influence anybody, the first question I will ask them is, what is your, let's imagine, Liz, you were working for a CEO and you wanted to influence, he was making a mess and you wanted to influence him. Right? The first thing I would say to you is, through the eyes of your CEO, what is your currency? And your currency is a metaphor for trust. So what is your level of credibility with your boss right at this particular moment in time on a scale of 0 to 10? Not how do you rate yourself, how would your boss rate you?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So how much do they believe that you're an expert in what you're trying to advise them on, right? Number one. Number two, your reliability. When they experience you, do you actually do what you say you will? And are you a good example of whatever it is that you're preaching, right? We always have to be a role model first and a preacher second. Like when I decided to get, a hardcore personal trainer, I didn't get an obese alcoholic smoker. Right? I picked a guy who used to coach the Sydney Swans. He's a young guy, but he's an example of everything that I want to create. I'm nearly 52 now, and this guy is much earlier in his life. He's about 30. I'm at the gym at 5:30. He's there before me getting his own workout in, right? So when he tells me to do something, he has credibility and reliability before we even start. But the third most important part of your currency is your intent or your motive, perceived intent or motive. So when you're giving your boss advice, why do they believe you're giving them that advice? Do they think you have an agenda? Do they think you're trying to manipulate them in some way?
Do they think you're condescending to them in some way? Or do they think that you are trying to help them in their best interests, not yours, right? And so your currency is, if you have high currency, then it's about courage. If you don't have high currency, there's really not much you can do. You really are never going to have much influence because you don't have the credibility, you don't have the currency for them to take you seriously. But if you do have high currency, then it's a question of your risk appetite. So relative to the feedback you're about to give them, now maybe it's not a big piece of feedback and so you don't need a lot of courage, but if it was something that could be significant, you've got to now work out what are you prepared to stake on this, you know? For example, if I'm working with a CEO, let's say in a multinational company, CEO of a multinational subsidiary, let's say I'm working with the head of Asia Pacific, who has a boss who's the CEO of the whole corporation, and they're really frustrated with something and they've got high currency, their boss is really driving them mad, and they've got to give the boss some really tough feedback. The conversation I'm having with them is, what is your level of courage here on a scale of 0 to 10? What are you prepared to stake? Are you prepared to walk away? Are you prepared to resign if they don't take your feedback seriously? That would be 10 out of 10 courage. Mm-hmm. Or are you really worried about upsetting this person and you really can't afford to be in the bad books, or then I wouldn't advise you to do anything. If you've got high currency and you've got high courage, then you are a weapon in terms of influence, right? And so one of the reasons why I can, give very direct feedback, very challenging feedback. In fact, I would give the people I serve the most brutal feedback they would ever get from anybody, and I give it to them all the time. And at the end of it, they say, thank you, is because I have high currency and high courage. I don't just have credibility and the resumes and the stories and the advocacy. They believe that I am there to serve them. The reason I'm telling them this is not because it's necessarily comfortable for me. It's because I want them to be the best they can be, and I take my responsibilities very seriously. And if I cared for them, that's what they would do. And I have high courage because A, I believe that it's the right thing to do, and B, fortunately for me, there are plenty of people who want my services, so I have an abundance mindset, not scarcity. So I'm prepared to, if they take it badly, I know I did it in their best interest, and I'm prepared for the consequences of that outcome. To the point where, and I'll share with you a very specific example, which is counterintuitive. Obviously, when you're in a consulting company, you want big, wonderful clients like the Microsofts of the world and Telstra's and the Macquarie, all these companies. When they come knocking at your door, most consultants would chew off their right, especially if it's a CEO, they chew off their right arm in order to get the contract, right? Because if you're a consultant, you don't sell, you don't eat. And so once a prospective client demonstrates some interest in me and us, which is very flattering and very humbling, rather than do what most consultants would do, which is say, all right, Liz, you're the CEO of XYZ company and you're an amazing company and you're showing interest in working with me and us. What most consultants would do in that moment is they'd say, Liz, let me tell you about all the wonderful days we're going to have together. It's going to be like Queensland. It's going to be beautiful one day and brilliant the next, right? And wait till I tell you about our third day. It's going to be magnificent. I do the exact opposite. I'll say, Liz, before you get too excited, let me tell you about our worst days together. And then at the end of that, you tell me if you're still excited to partner. The first bad day we're going to have is when I tell you that you're half the problem. Is that moment going to be a day where you're open and curious and you want to take ownership of that, or are you going to reject that? And the second bad day could be when we figure out that a couple of your team members are not up for it, right? What are you going to do at that moment? Are you going to take action, or are you going to massage it over and smooth it out? So we're having an active conversation where I am demonstrating I'm more passionate about the outcome and their success than I am about my needs, my safety, my outcomes. And that's very persuasive when you are dealing with somebody with greater positional authority than you. So we can talk now about the kind of the tools and tactics for how you get people to focus off busy work and so on. But it's very important before you do any of that, that you have high currency and high courage, because they are the instruments really for influence.
I really appreciate you taking the time to dive into that. Yeah, thank you. if you would like to share a couple of tactics, that would be wonderful. I'm sure my listeners would appreciate it.
Yeah, so if we go on to the specific question where we started, which is around, your boss is lost in busy work and you want to help them. And obviously that's, if your boss is someone significant, particularly if it's a CEO or a business unit head, if they're busy and chasing their backside, like a puppy in the park, doesn't know which ball to chase, your life, not only is their life going to be chaotic, your life's going to be chaotic, and then the whole organization is going to be chaotic, right? So if you can help them to become more focused, even better. So the first principle of this is there's no such thing as time management. There's only choice management, okay? I know you've heard me say that before, Liz. It's really important because what people complain about when they don't get things done is, I didn't have enough time. There's no such thing as time management. We have all the time there is. Unless you have a Doctor Who time machine, or something I don't know, there's exactly 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day. We all have exactly the same amount of time. What we need to do is make much better choices. And so really the challenge of busy work and people complaining about time is actually, how do we help those we serve to make better choices? And so I'll give you some of the ways that we do it, and I would encourage your listeners to do it. The first thing is, in every big company we work with the leaders at that, the top 2, 3, 4 layers, we use an instrument that I developed many years ago. It's my secret weapon in big corporations for aligning leaders to what's most important. It's called a leadership scorecard. Now, the tool itself is less important than what it's trying to do, but basically the cycle we do, so leaders have goals they've got for the year, right? Typically what happens is they set goals for the year, then they go off and get lost in whatever they're doing. They have task lists of 1,000 things to do, and then they come back at the end of the year and realize they haven't achieved all the things, or they work way too hard for way too little, and so on. So what we will do is we will say, okay, given the goals that you have for the next 12 months or 3 years or whatever, and the key roles that you play as a leader, as a strategist, as an operations manager, whatever the roles they have are, because they will have multiple roles if they can obviously afford to have an EA supporting them. What are the key things that you need to deliver? Not the principles, but what are the key things you need to deliver in the next quarter, the next 3 months? And we get it down to a really tangible deliverable. So an example would be, let's imagine the CEO that I work with has a goal to create at least 2, but ideally 3 potential successes for his or her role in the next 12 months, right? So that CEO is thinking about transition, retirement, or whatever, and they've now got to give 3 options to the board in the next, say, 1 to 2 years. It's a big goal. What's the deliverable for the next quarter only? So the deliverable is not coach my team members to higher levels of performance. It's more like put development plans in place for every one of my executives. Identify the 3 most likely potential successes and engage them, assess their desire to participate in a succession process. So we break it down to really clear deliverables, right? And so we do that for each of the key roles the leader plays, and they might have 5 key roles and 2 or 3 key deliverables. So what we work out is actually in the next quarter, there's only really 10, 12, maximum 15 things that really matter, and they're the game changers, right? And so then ideally that CEO goes to their team, their assistant and everybody else and says, until this is done, nothing else is important in the next quarter. And so then as an EA, you have the ability to diarize and align. So Jess knows what's important in my life even before I articulate it. So does the rest of the team. They can all see my diary. They can see my priorities. We share our scorecards openly. And so they can then all make good decisions about how they prioritize their time. So that's the first tool that we use. And that tool is in Enixa as a system. Exactly the same tool I use with the biggest, the baddest CEOs in the country and around the world. It's there for anybody to use. I would encourage every EA to use it personally. It's the first thing. The second thing, I'll give you 3 specific tools that I use more often. The second one would be to help your boss design their ideal week. Their ideal week is effectively, given, again, the big goals that they have, given the priorities that they articulate in a scorecard or in some other way, given the key roles, what would their perfect week look like? Now, knowing that, it's not possible to live that perfect week, rarely, if ever, but you've got to have a picture of it, right? So what would given all these things, given the role, given the context, what would a perfect and ideal week look like? And before you all the reasons why it can't be possible, just focus 100% of your attention on it. And so again, there's a process. It's articulated in Enixa that I take every CEO through. And the first thing I will say to them is, just talk to me about the principles for your ideal week. So for example, one of the principles of my ideal week is ideally not to have meetings in the morning, right? Why? Because I do my best. Part of my job is to think and create, whether that's creating IP or Enixa or strategizing the future. First and foremost, I'm an entrepreneur. I have my own companies, but also to think about big challenges that my clients are facing. I need clear thinking time. My best thinking time is between about 7:30 and 11:30 on an average day. If I fill that up with meetings and then try and do the thinking work in the afternoon, no chance, right? Whereas if I'm clear until about midday, then I break and have lunch, I'm an early riser, I can then do meetings all afternoon with lots of energy because I love connecting with the people I serve, and that has a natural rhythm. So a perfect day for me is 3 to 4 hours of clear space with 2 or 3 usually 1 or 2 big problems to solve, big challenges, and then 3 or 4 or 5 big meetings in the afternoon with CEOs, chairs, maybe even a speaking engagement, which I can naturally energize around. That's just an example of a principle. So knowing that, when Jess is booking meetings with the 10 CEOs that I serve out months in advance, usually she's looking for afternoons first. Right. Now, of course, there are weeks where every week I've got to do something in the morning because I'm dealing with busy people, but at least I have an ideal understanding. So creating an ideal week is a start point for all of that. And again, there's a process. The third thing, which is actually my go-to tool, and I use this tool personally every Sunday night, but I've also used this same tool to help organizations prioritize billions of dollars worth of strategic initiatives. And that is what I call the $100 test. So like you and everybody else that's got lots to do, I have a long list at any given moment of tasks, and that's fine. So, I have my big goals, I have my quarterly deliverables, and then I have a task list, right? Things that, so I had an idea before as I was just walking around the office. I don't want to lose that idea. I've got to get it out of my head because my brain's not a system I trust. And I put it into my system, which is a task system that I use, put the idea in there, the action, now it's in there. There's usually 100 things in there at any given time. On a Sunday night, I look at that list, given my priorities, given my diary, and I ask myself one question. If I only had $100 to spend in the next week, the week starting, and $100 was a metaphor for my time and attention, how would I spend that $100 against those tasks? I don't spend $1 per priority. I spend big bets, $20, $50, $30, $40, usually on 3, 4, or 5 things maximum over the course of a week, right? And I can tell you I've been doing that. I developed that tool for myself about 22 years ago, just to try and cope with starting a new business and a frantic life and wanting to start a family, all that stuff. And I still have not found a better tool for that today. So you could say to your boss, your EAs could say to their boss, you've said you've got all of these, but if you only had $100 to spend in the next week, how would you spend it? What are the really big priorities? Guaranteed they will only have 3 or 4 or 5 big things. And then you can be saying to them, okay, well, we've got a lot of other stuff in your diary that has nothing to do with those. Should we clean it out and actually prioritize around these things?
That is fantastic. Thank you. And that leads me perfectly to the fact that all of those things the 3 tips that you shared and so much of the other ideas that you've shared are things that are in this platform, Enixa. So I will have talked in the intro about Enixa, but I would love it if you could just I will tell you right now that what I will be saying in the introduction about Enixa is I feel that Enixa is the Canva. It is democratizing leadership development for individual contributors. And I don't know if that's what you envisioned for it, but that's what I love about it. So can you please tell the listeners how Enixa came about what your vision for it is.
I'm just smiling, Liz, because you basically articulated the purpose of Enixa, which is to democratize leadership. Now, I don't, democratize is one of those kind of wanky management words. That's how I think about it. So basically what I say, Enixa is a leadership app for everybody, right? It's meant to make leadership accessible for anybody who wants it, based on 3 fundamental principles. Number 1, I've already shared with you that anybody can lead from anywhere at any time in any context, including you. It's got nothing to do with authority. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second principle that Enixa was designed around is that it's not possible to truly lead anyone else until you first lead yourself. You've got to be a role model first and a preacher second, right? Organizations don't change, people do. And then the third principle is that success does not come in any journey. Success does not come from one big thing. It comes from what is often called the aggregation of marginal gains, lots of small 2% turns that build an unstoppable momentum. So in a nutshell, my reason for building it is to make leadership accessible for anybody who wants it. And your target audience is a perfect example of that. It's really made up of 2 things. I'll give you kind of the Reader's Digest version of this in 3 minutes or less. It's made up of content and a couple of very important interactive tools, one of which we've already mentioned. On the content side, as you know, Enixa has 150 plus distinct leadership lessons spread across 20 modules and programs. There's 15 modules and 5 programs. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it is. It's my life's work. It's literally the codification of everything that I've proven to work. It's not just thought leadership, it's practice leadership through research and practice, everything I've proven. But each lesson, so as big as it is, each lesson is delivered in a bite-sized format. So you can do a lesson in 10 minutes or less, if that's all you've got. And with just 10 minutes a day, you can transform your outcomes. The other thing that's a little bit unique about the content, this is a formula I figured out not that long ago when I was building Enixa. To codify this kind of content and make it accessible to anybody, it needs 3 things. So every lesson has a story for the heart, insights for the head, and tactics for the hands. So with those 3 things, you can move somebody from having no idea about something to not only understanding it, but being able to integrate, make it make sense to them, and then give them the tools to execute it immediately. An example is something we've already spoken about, which is there's no such thing as time management. There's only choice management. I could expand on that, and then I would give you tools like the $100 test, ideal way. Then off you go. You go, that makes sense. Of course, there's no such thing as that. And away you go. You're empowered to do it. The last thing I would say on the content for now is that it's not just the typical leadership content on empowering people and building trust and increasing your influence, though all of those things are there. It's actually also content to help you develop personally. So how to manage your emotions, for example, how to experience less anxiety, how to increase your well-being and personal productivity, right? How to get more done with less effort, how to have less stress in your life, and much more. So the idea is it supports the human being, not just the human doing. Then on the tool side, there are 2 tools. I already mentioned the leadership scorecard, which is the secret weapon. But before that, there is an aspirations tool. And this is exactly the same thing that I do with every CEO that I've ever worked with, about 300 of them now, where I help them to define their purpose, their personal purpose, their values, and their goals, right? So it takes you through a process so you can really figure out not just what you want to achieve, but who you really want to be. And for me, that's really critical if you want to help somebody explore their leadership potential. So look, Enixa has been live for 4 years now, though we completely rebuilt it. It was started with a renovation. Then we decided to knock the house down, and then we decided to dig up the foundations and start again, which is saying something a little bit about my obsessive nature based on feedback and where it could be better. I'm very proud. It's only been in the market now about 8 weeks, the new product. The feedback has been amazing. It was on the last version, but this one is next level. And people are using it for all sorts of things to advance their career and feel more balanced and get more done and increase their influence and make an impact and all those good things. And obviously my wish is that it does that for the maximum number of people possible, not least of all your audience. And the good news is it comes with a complimentary 30-day trial. You don't even have to put your credit card in. We believe so much in the product that we know that anybody who has a go with it will see the value of it. So
I will, of course, be putting a link to it in the show notes, because it is something that I have done the 30-day free trial of, because I wanted to see the new platform, even though I was familiar with the earlier iterations and your work, obviously. But I can attest to exactly all of the things that you've just described, that it is bite-sized chunks. And just say that again. So it's story for the heart, which for the listeners, the way that works is that each little module has a video of Peter speaking about an experience of a leader that he's worked with. Then what was the next one? It was tactics.
Insights for the head. So
insights for the head.
Here's the logic.
Yep. And then the third part of it was, say that again.
Tactics for the hand. So here's the strategies. If you want to implement this into your life, here's how you do it.
And the way that works is that you, in order for you to complete the module, you need to do a self-reflection, which is, doesn't take long, but each question is compulsory, is mandatory. And it is just, I absolutely love it. And I love the fact that, I can set it up in my calendar, to have a reminder for, whether it's daily or weekly, to complete a certain amount of the lessons. I think, I just want to congratulate you on a wonderful platform, an innovation from Australia. And as I said, my listeners are all around the world. So on that point, is it something, it's obviously available internationally if somebody was to come on from another geography, they would be able to sign up for a 30-day free trial.
Absolutely. It's been international from the get-go. In fact, the agency that built the first one was a New York-based agency when I was spending a lot of time over there. I would say today much more than half the users are international.
Okay.
Has a big audience. You just reminded me of something else when you were talking about it, Liz, through the there are levels of mastery, so the questions you might have noticed.
Yes.
Which is another principle. Obviously, I didn't go into it just for time reasons, but with any kind of learning, the ideal pathway is to go from understanding. So I'd never thought about, for example, that there was no such thing as time, actually it's choice management. I never really thought about it that way before, blah, blah, blah. That made sense. I understand that now. I complete the reflection questions. I get it. Next time I go back to that lesson, it's going to ask me different questions. And those questions are going to be about integrating those principles into your life. Are you actually doing this now?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's what it's asking you. How is it actually working? What are you learning from implementing it? How is your life different as a consequence, etc.? That's when you do it the second time. When you do it the third time, now you have to be coaching others in how to do this.
Yeah.
So if you think about, your audience moving from, they can move very quickly from never having thought about something before through integrating it into, understanding it, integrating it into their life, and then becoming an expert and teaching it to others. That's actually where I get really excited. That's what it means for me to democratize leadership, that people take this stuff. 90% of the people who use Enixa, I don't know and will never know, but I love hearing their stories. And I think over time, that's where I can see the platform growing, integrating the stories of people like you and your listeners who've used it to make an impact in their world, in their organizations, to serve communities. That's what really gets me excited. That's a real legacy.
And I can see that. The listeners obviously can't see you because this is audio, but on vision, I can, I'm looking at you on Zoom and I can see that excitement in your face. Well, so Peter, I will put a link to Enixa and the platform in the show notes. If people did want to reach out to you or to your organisation, what would be the best way for them to do that? Yes. I was going to refer to it as TAP, but that's I know that's the acronym. So the alignment partnership.
Yeah. So again, there's a number of So let's start with the really easiest thing. So obviously Enixa's the digital platform. Great, everybody will know how to do that. The other thing is that, as you know, we pump out a lot of stuff in social, which is completely complimentary. And obviously, if someone sends me a LinkedIn invitation, we'll accept it. We're on Instagram and Twitter, and we put a lot of stuff out there, which anybody can choose to follow. TAP, the management consulting company, is a CEO client type thing, and very, we only have 10 clients at a time. We usually have a bit of a wait list. But if anybody just wants to reach out, and Jess manages all platforms, but you can just go to the email that everybody can go to is peter@peterfuda.com. Jess manages that. If you've got a particular question, an inquiry of some part, she manages that, and she'll be able to help you across whatever the need is. There's obviously a lot of different places we can go.
Fantastic. Well, I will put all those links in the show notes. And Peter, just to finish off, if you could recommend a book or a resource aside from Enixa, because I think that's obviously our go-to resource, what is something else that you would recommend specifically for my audience who are assistants and admin professionals?
So I think the last part of that is really important, because for me, the role that EAs make organizations turn, right? They are literally the people that turn the wheels on the organization. And so for me, the most powerful EAs are purposeful EAs. And I'll share with you the book that's had the most profound, it's a very old book, the book that had the most profound impact on me ever. And I've read, probably more than 1,000 nonfiction books in my life, maybe more. It's a very old book, and it's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Viktor Frankl.
Yeah. So that's still the book I recommend for everybody. It's actually quite a small book.
It is. I did it I've read that a long time ago when I was in Year 12. So
there you go. It's a very profound book. And
it is.
So for your listeners, the first half is basically his experience of life in concentration camps. He's a Holocaust survivor. He's a psychiatrist and psychologist. And so he had this extraordinary experience of being subject to all of that horrific stuff, but being able to observe it somewhat detached. And he came up with basically the difference between those who survived and those who didn't, really came down to a sense of unfinished purpose in their life. Didn't have anything to do with their education or their wealth or anything like that. And so the first half of the book is his experience, which is very it's horrific and moving all at the same time. And the second half of the book is the theory of psychology and psychiatry that he developed as a consequence, called logotherapy, which is purpose-based therapy, basically, which has had very, very powerful, probably had more of an influence on me and my thinking than any other single resource. So if your listeners have not read that book, I would absolutely recommend they start there.
Well, thank you, because that's given me I might go back and reread it, because as a Year 12, very different person, different part of my life. I think I only really absorbed a lot of the first half and not so much of the second half. So, Peter, thank you so much for being a guest on Assist with Impact. It's been an absolute delight to have you, and I feel really honoured that you've made the time to be here for my listeners. So thank you.
Liz, it's my pleasure, my privilege, and I think the next time you need to get the real star of the show on here, which is Jess.
I will absolutely be doing that. So, Jess, watch out for that invitation.
Thank you, Liz. Have a good day.
Thanks very much, Peter.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to today's show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see the show notes, head over to my website. It would be great if you haven't already done so. If you enjoyed the show, if you could kindly go to iTunes and leave a review. It helps other people find the show. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.